Hello, everyone. I hope you guys are having a good afternoon. Before we get started, I just want to make sure that everyone has the app downloaded. So right up here on the screen, you will see a QR code. If you guys could just kindly take your phones out, scan the code. It will take you to a link, which will then take you to an app store where you can download the app. This will be used for all kinds of stuff throughout the whole conference, so it will be very useful for you to have.
And once you're in the app homepage, tap on the agenda, then tap on today's date, the 21st of June, and then we would like to kindly ask you, once you also tap on the SNF Dialogues event, to complete this poll that we have prepared for you, as your answers will be used during the event. So sit tight, and we'll be back with you soon.
That's right, and if you guys need any help, feel free to reach out to Celia or I or any of the members of the Youth Advisory Committee.
And also, if you don't have a seat, don't worry. The whole event will be live broadcasted outside at the Agora, so you can also watch it from there. Thank you.
There's a river in the green field of mine. Sometimes it's black, sometimes it's white, like the cloudy mountains. Some days the grass is blooming, some days it turns to dust. I'm a tree longing for the sun, hoping that it lasts. There's a river in the green field of mine.
SNF Nostos 2023 is on its way to help analyze, discuss, and normalize every aspect of mental health on June 20th, 21st, 22nd, and 23rd. Learning, conversation, and entertainment become one and prove that taking care of our interior worlds begins out there. SNF Nostos 2023 from the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. Release, rethink, refocus on mental health.
Welcome to the SNF Dialogues and welcome to the SNF Nostos Conference 2023. Today the SNF Dialogues kick off the Nostos Conference, and I would like to share with you a flavor. The next 3 days, starting from now actually, so today and the next 2 days, thinkers, researchers and activists from a wide range of fields will provide their precious views on mental health. And today, what we will try to do is to create this bridge through which actually we'll put this very sensitive issue under SNF Dialogues lens. As many of you who have been following our journey over the past 5 years already know, at SNF Dialogues, approach any issue, and we fully believe that any subject has a political importance. Mental health is not just a medical matter, but also a great social and therefore political matter. That's why it concerns us all, because all of us are humans and citizens. The way political discourse takes place today often makes us feel, me, very often, anger, insecurity, even fear. It also makes us feel disengaged, without any access, and at the same time we're spectators of an almost derby. Feel like a game between group of peoples who fight for the win. a derby where participation means partnership. And the role of citizens almost has shifted. The essence of being citizen transforms more in a being loyal. In an obsolete political system, we citizens sometimes feel disconnected, often wondering what's going on with our vote. We voted, but what comes next? Where is the power? Is there any effect on the policy making? Meanwhile, a word, a very famous word, comes again and again on the surface: polarization. Yesterday, during the symposium on power and purpose, a symposium on mental health and democratic agency, which was hosted here at the SNFCC at the library, designed and hosted by the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University, and Harry is here. Among other very interesting things, at some point we heard that if the citizens are healthy, their democracy is healthier. However, compelling evidence suggests that political polarization has a two-way impact on mental health, resulting in a vicious cycle. According to the 2022 American Psychological Association Stress in American Survey, a significant portion of respondents, 66%, identified the present political climate as a major source of stress in their lives. Additionally, 60% reported experiencing stress due to social divisiveness. Hence, it becomes crucial for us to comprehend the intersection of politics and mental health and why this relationship holds immense significance. Today's SNF Dialogues take place in Athens through a dynamic collaboration with the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. It's a very sensitive issue. It's a very sensitive theme, even to discuss about politics. What about when we have to discuss about our mental health and the relationship? So it's very important, the fact that we have started working together with a team from the Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University, writing, declining, thinking, starting from the zero again and again, so that we can try to understand first and foremost, we, the teams, the theme, to notice the problems, and to decide what and why to highlight, and to see with our speakers, and I'm going to invite them in a few minutes to start our discussions, how and if we can find potential solutions, because it's very nice speaking, but enough. Let's do what we can do. So, before we start our discussion, I would like also to remind you that for first time today, SNF Dialogues will feature live polling involving all of you. As always, your participation is crucial, is part of the discussion. So please answer, reply to the questions. There are 3 questions. It's very easy. And of course, you can share our questions, our comments, whatever you want through our app. Celia and Thibaut explained everything to you in a detailed way. Thank you both. They are members also of the team and to the whole effort here today. But before we start our discussion, I would love inviting on the stage Harry Hahn, the director of the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University, because we would like you, Harry, to share your thoughts on the very, very crucial issue of polarization. Please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Come on, this is a dialogue. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here today. I want to start just by thanking SNF Dialogues for inviting us to partner with you on this really important discussion about the complex relationship between polarization and mental health. I also want to thank all of you who are joining us today, this afternoon in person, and everyone who's joining us online. We really appreciate you coming here to be part of this discussion with us. For those of you who don't know, the SNF Agora Institute was started in 2017 with a transformative gift from the Stavros Niarchos Foundation to Johns Hopkins University. We are an academic and public forum that is dedicated to improving and expanding civic engagement and informed, inclusive dialogue as the cornerstone of global democracy. And so to that end, yesterday, as Anna-Kynthia said, we hosted a symposium here at the SNFCC that looked at the relationship, the cyclical relationship, really, between democracy and mental health. And so on the one hand, we wanted to ask, how is it that our mental health, that our well-being, the way in which we feel, shapes our ability to get involved in public life, to be part of our communities and the communities that we inhabit? And vice versa, how is it that the contours of our democracy shape how we feel, how well that we can be as people, as a community? And I think a lot of the themes that emerged from the discussion yesterday are relevant for the conversation today. And we talked about emotion and the ways in which the emotions that we feel when we see vitriol or gridlock in our politics, how that shapes our willingness and our interest in getting involved. We talked about design, how it is that we can or should be designing our public squares, both digital and in person, to shape the ways in which we can connect with each other. And we talked about movements, how it is that movements play such an important role in democracy because they create a vehicle for us to work together to imagine the world that we want to create and then put our hands on the levers of change. Except that when we ourselves don't feel well, we can't participate in those movements, right? And without us, there is no democracy. And so we're really excited. The symposium yesterday then was, in looking holistically at democracy and mental health, I think laid a really good foundation for the conversation today about the relationship between polarization and mental health. And I think it raised some questions that are important for us to keep in mind. For example, how does it make us feel when we see the kind of gridlock and divisiveness that characterizes so many of the societies and the communities where we live? How do we deal with and experience the uncertainty of this particular moment that we're living in? We're living through a moment of tremendous economic, technological, political, and social change all over the world, and how does that impact all of us? And finally, how do some of us feel when we feel afraid to express what we believe or to ask questions because we're afraid of people disagreeing with us? And so these are all questions that we hope to be exploring. But as we think about them just initially, it may not be a total surprise that there's more and more emerging research showing that there's a link between polarization and people's mental health. That the more polarized our societies become, the more people feel depressed or anxious. But a question I think for us to probe is polarization the problem, or is it the symptom of something bigger? Some of you might be surprised to know that in 1950, the American Political Science Association, which is the professional association of political scientists like me, issued a report saying that American politics was doomed because it was not polarized enough. Right? In other words, they were concerned that we didn't have enough polarization in America at that time because they understood that disagreement and debate is fundamental to a healthy democracy. And so if disagreement and debate are fundamental to making democracy work, then why is it that so much of the disagreement that we see today makes us feel unwell? I think those are the kinds of questions that we hope to be exploring. But before I close, I want to share with you a story about my friend Kelly. I first spoke about my friend Kelly 4 years ago when I first had the opportunity to come to Nostos. This is someone who I grew up with from the moment that we met when we were 6 years old in first grade, and we grew up together. We pulled each other's hair. We dressed up for the Texas rodeo where we grew up and for Halloween, and we were the maid of honor in each other's weddings. And when we were younger, we used to like to make lists of the ways in which we were similar to each other. We both have short moms. I'm also short, as it turns out now. We both hate spaghetti. We both love to read. We both hate practicing piano. That always reminds me that neither of us could spell, apparently. But as I look at that, when I was a kid, we didn't know that when we first became friends that we would grow up to have very different political futures. My first job out of college was working for a Democratic member of Congress. I've gone on to work for 2 different Democratic presidential campaigns. Kelly, on the other hand, chose a career completely outside of politics. She went on and became an accountant, and now votes in completely different ways. In 2016 and 2020, I voted for Clinton and Biden, and she voted for Donald Trump twice. But nonetheless, we're still really good friends. And in fact, today, we had lunch together near Syntagma Square because she happened to be in Athens with her family. And what that reminded me is the fact that despite our political differences, there's so much history and so much that brings us together that still forms the bonds of the friendship that we have. And so I tell you that story just to remind us that we have a common humanity that we can all share, and a shared purpose that we can all look towards, even as we might disagree fiercely about political issues before us. And so I think that's part of the reason why I'm so delighted that the SNF Dialogues chose to have a conversation about this topic, to really probe and understand how we got to where we are now, what that means and how we might make sense of it, so that we can begin to work towards healing the fractured political landscape that we have together. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I'll turn it back over to Anna-Kynthia.
Thank you so much, Harry. Thank you. So I would like to invite now the 2 speakers that are joining our today's discussion is Dr. Liliana Mason, Associate Professor of Political Science at the SNF Agora Institute. Welcome, Dr. Mason. Thank you so much. And Dr. Peter Ditto, Professor of Psychological Science at the University of California, Irvine. Welcome, Professor Ditto. Thank you so much. Meanwhile, I remind once again to all of you that we're waiting your answers to the questions on the polling that it is on. And I would like to get immediately into the discussion with a question to both of you. So I remind to all of us that the title of today's discussion is Reconnecting in a Fractured Political Landscape. And actually what we will try to investigate and understand at the same time is the interrelation between politics, polarization, and mental health. And this, let's be our starting point. So, which is this relation that we are talking about? I mean, between politics and our mental health. So to start from this base, a question from both of you. Would you like to start, Dr. Mason?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for having me here. It's great to see all these people and everyone online. The way that I have thought about this relationship in my research has actually been to go one step back and think, what are the elements of our normal human psychology that affect how we participate in politics? And so I think it's important to start there because there are a lot of misperceptions. There are common understandings in sort of the news and journalism that the way that we participate in politics is rational, it's thoughtful, we weigh the 2 sides of every debate, we look at the parties' set of policies and their platforms, and then we make a very calm, reasoned decision about who to vote for as voters. But in fact, human psychology, it doesn't participate in the world that way most of the time. And once we have a sense that we are on one team and someone else is on a different team, it is our priority not to be reasonable and thoughtful, but instead to win. And our natural psychological priority is to say, we are us, they are them, therefore, I want to make sure that we are better and that we emerge victorious from this competition that we're in. The problem with applying that very natural psychology to politics is that we have elections. And elections are regularly scheduled status competitions. That's what they turn into in our minds. So that we can, one very easy way to think of a danger of this process is to think, we go into the voting booth not thinking which party will be better for my family, my community, and instead basically, how do I make sure that my party wins? And that's the baseline of going into politics. If our leaders orient us that way, if our leaders remind us we are us, they are them, our leaders could also say we are all Americans, and we might think differently. But in our current politics, particularly in the United States and in any polarized place, the way that our leaders speak to us is we must win because they are a disaster, and they are sometimes even evil. So we go into these contests not acting like normal citizens, not acting like ideal citizens, but instead doing our best to find victory above all else. And that often hurts the well-being of us, the people around us, and the country as a whole, but that is the way that we are participating in politics from the very beginning.
Based on what you just shared with us, I would like to ask you, Dr. Dito, why now? I mean, what Dr. Mason just described is something that we have to deal with, we have to face and try to figure out how we can deal with. Actually, now, it's the first time actually that this takes place. To the name of victory, I mean, to have all these dynamics and the fight, the derby actually. You use the word of...
Yes, and thanks for having me also. It's not particularly novel. I mean, there's always been polarization. Politics is about having a moral vision and then trying to implement that through policy. People differ on those things, and I think that's a very complicated question. Why today? I mean, so the first thing to note about it is that politics now, at this juncture, has tended to become moralized. And what I mean by that is there's sort of two sort of idealized ways that you can think about how politics operates. One is I think my opponent shares my intentions and goals, but we just have different ideas about how to get there. That's this kind of idealized sense that we have that at best they're the loyal opposition, and at worst they're dumb. They're stupid, they're misguided because they have the right idea about how to get to the goal. There's a different way, and then there's this other sort of moralized way of thinking about where the other side doesn't share our intentions and goals. They've got different moral agenda, they may not even have maybe an illicit agenda. We're trying to help the country, they're trying to take it down, enrich themselves. And that's a very different sense. It's not, in that sense, your opponents aren't necessarily dumb, they're evil. And that's an important switch. When people think about politics in that moralized way, it really changes. It's very different to think that your opponent is dumb than to think that they're evil, right? It inflames passions. It gives you, it just changes the ball game completely. And I think that's where we're at now, and it's all of this is exacerbated by a new sort of technological environment where the social media sends things virally. There's a bifurcated media environment very often where we have a conservative media, a liberal media. People know exactly where to find information, and so all those things sort of entrench those moral beliefs, the sense that our opponents are evil people rather than just simply misguided or dumb.
Dr. Dito, I know that your work revolves around morality. So, and when I say revolves around morality, I mean as a core concept that defines our role and our emotions, our sentiments as citizens. So, how does morality affect our citizens' behavior?
Good. So, I mean, I'm a psychologist, so I study how people think about morality, not what's really right or wrong, but what people think is morally right and wrong. And importantly, I think morality is a double-edged sword. The paradox of morality is that it connects us with other people. It's the sort of greatest expression of our social nature, the way we feel about concern for others' well-being and the greater good. At the very same time, it separates us from others. It cleaves society at its joints so that people who have different moral views than you, again, feel like a very different sort of person, and it breeds a kind of sort of moral distaste and distrust. And so that, and again, that's a very different kind of politics. And let me sort of lay out sort of three metaphors, and people can take their choice of which metaphor they like. But when I think about moralized politics, there's sort of three ways to think about it. So in some of my writings, I've talked about tribalism. So that's a word that we use a lot, where you have two groups that are surrounded by some sacred ideas that binds them together and separates them from other people. And that's what morality takes teams and turns them into tribes. Another way to think about it is sort of with a religious sense to it. When it becomes moralized, it becomes sort of pseudo-religious. In a sort of recent review paper that a bunch of political scientists, political psychologists authored together in the journal Science that Liliana and I are both co-authors on, we talked about political sectarianism. So we compared it to sectarian battle. So in the United States, it's like these two sects of the American civil religion in this holy war, convinced that they understand the gospel of the founding fathers, and they're the only ones that understand that, right? And it has that quality of where Democrats and Republicans become more like Shias and Sunnis in a sense. It's energized by that kind of moral fervor. And the third way to think about it is, I think, particularly relevant, I think, in a two-party system, is it's like a toxic marriage. Mm-hmm. So it's two people two groups in a relationship, right, where they have to get along. They've got children to take care of, and they've sort of forgotten about the children, and they're more interested in fighting with each other and beating the other side. And I think all those sort of have that quality. And I think the toxic marriage example in particular sort of gives you a sense of the mental health consequences of all this, mm-hmm. right? So you imagine the difference between a healthy marriage and a toxic one and what that does to people. And I think that's kind of the situation we're in right now.
I'm coming to you, Dr. Mason, because at the same time, you have been involved through the research. You have been running all the researches actually, that you have been running all of these years on the field of citizens' emotions, of citizens' sentiments. So, first of all, I need you to share with us an explanation, a description. I don't know, you can call it however you want, but what does this mean, first of all? What does this expression mean? I mean, citizens' sentiments, and how it is countable.
Right. On one hand, we can think of our emotions as useful tools, first of all, right? If a lot of times, if we feel angry, we will get up and do something. If we feel proud and enthusiastic, we might get up and go help or volunteer or vote. If we feel anxious and afraid, we often will sit back and sort of close in to ourselves. But there's also the sort of feelings that we have for one another. And we, in my research, I ask people questions like, how would you feel if your child married somebody in the other party? And that is a good indicator for us of whether or not we are talking about policy and government, or whether we are talking about feelings towards each other. If the matter is policy and how government should run and the size of government, et cetera, then we should be fine with having our child marry someone from the other party. That's just politics. But if we've made a decision that people in the other party are undesirable as people, then that means that we don't want them in our home. Mm-hmm. And we also ask questions like, how warmly do you feel towards people in the other party? If 0 is very cold and 100 is very warm, where would you place them on this thermometer of feelings? And one thing we've seen over the last few decades is that our warmth towards people in the other party has been steadily declining. So even 50 years ago, we saw most people rating the two parties, maybe 20, 30 degrees apart. Mm-hmm. And now it's 70 degrees apart. So even just our feelings of basic warmth towards our fellow citizens have been changing remarkably. And that one thing that does is it really closes our minds to the idea of compromise, to the idea that people on the other side are well-intentioned, right? We can have we can have a generous interpretation of other people's motives. We can say they probably mean well, as Dr. Ditto was saying, they probably mean well, but they're just wrong. Or maybe they don't mean well at all. And increasingly what we're finding is that people, as they think about how they feel about people on the other team, are saying they don't mean well. In fact, they want to destroy me, they want to destroy my family, they want to destroy my children. And as we're measuring this in our surveys across time, we can see it in front of us with the numbers themselves. It's not simply that we're hearing these things more frequently. It's that when we survey Americans across a random sample of Americans, what we find is that more and more people are telling us that they have these very negative feelings for those in the other party. And that really does affect how we participate in politics, whether we want our elected representatives to compromise at all, which of course democracy requires compromise, whether we want our government to succeed or fail, in fact. Often if the other team is in charge of government, we actually want the government to fail, the government of our own country to fail, because we would prefer that they not have any power or success, because we believe that they are evil and not just wrong.
So if I can, from my side, I mean, someone who hears whatever you just shared with us can make the conclusion that although it should be normal, or at least for now I'm sharing with you my opinion as citizen being. I mean, although each government should take care and serve, actually, not just the voters, not just the law, I mean, anyway, the supporters of this X side, but the whole state, the whole nation, citizens very often feel that if this government, it is not run by the party that they had voted, they are isolated, actually. They're not on the spotlight, right?
If they feel that the government is helping people not like them,
yeah,
then often, once we are in this place where we feel so identified with our team, with our party, then helping the voters or the citizens of the other party feels like a betrayal to us. And there was a story that I remember from, there was a time during the Trump administration where I think there had been a factory that had closed that he had promised he was going to keep open. Mm-hmm. And there was an interview, the news media interviewed one woman who had been fired she had to leave, that was her job. And they said, well, what do you think, how do you feel about this? She was a Trump supporter. And she said, well, I'm just so confused. He's hurting the wrong people. Like, he should be hurting people, but not my people, right? And so there was this very visceral sense of, I want him to hurt people in America, but I want him to only hurt the people that I don't like.
I'm very curious to see the first results to the questions through the polling that we ran, what all of you who are here with us have already answered so far, I mean, because I hope that more of you will join. Around 160 from you in this hall have already replied. So 68% says yes to the question, do you want to live in a world without polarization? Yes, 68%. 32% says no. It's interesting because Harry at some point mentioned that through her remarks. Is it the problem or is it a symptom, the polarization? So I'm very curious to hear of both of you answering this question. Let's see the results to the second question, please, if we're ready. Do you enjoy discussing with people who share totally different views? 79% say yes. That's very good. I belong probably to the no. I mean, because I feel I feel that many people don't like me when I share my ideas, and they're completely different with them. So 21% says no. And the third question, have you ever felt angry because of politics? 95% says yes. So actually, yeah, Harry, I think we took the right decision having this discussion today. Okay, have we reached the point where polarization has become so ingrained that the opposing side is consistently demonized or even perceived as a threat? Dr. Dito, I will start from you.
Unfortunately, that's what I worry about. I mean, there's a sort of classic approach in social psychology how to bring people together, and it's called, the idea is if groups have superordinate goals, so goals that they can only reach by working together, and that sort of brings groups together. You know, the classic example of that is an external enemy. So when you have an external attack, like for example 9/11 in the United States, it tended to pull the country together at that point. So George W. Bush's approval ratings were very high for months afterwards. There was even reports of sort of decreased racial tensions and things like that. My fear now is that sort of moral outrage has reached some terminal velocity where a similar attack like that, for example, on the United States, just wouldn't pull people together. It would rip the country apart, and that's that's the risk of this. This kind of cascade of negative effects that come from polarization. One of those is distrust, right? So when the two sides simply distrust each other, and then you don't reach out to somebody in that situation, and all of that is reinforced by again this media environment where everybody's got the two sides have different facts, and they learn those facts from a different media. They sort of take in information that supports their beliefs. They reject information that doesn't, and so we've got these kind of firmed up sides that just seem like it's hard to imagine them sort of pulling together in some sort of external attack. It's much easier to see sort of a reaction of mutual recrimination and blame and just sort of setting this outrage spiral going faster and faster. And that's what I'm concerned about.
Can this, to what I asked, the fact that we understand as a threat everything is different, any different idea, any different approach, any different way of thinking. Can this be seen as a manifestation of an us versus we? It's something that you referred to earlier, but I would like to stay a bit more on that.
I mean, yes, I think that one of the interesting dynamics that we've started to see now is not just intra-party dynamics, not just inter-party dynamics, but intra-party dynamics. So within one party, one thing that I think has made this process of depolarizing very difficult is that we've started to see huge backlash against candidates who try to reach across to the other side. So in the 2020 election in the US, we saw Republican election administrators who certified the election for Joe Biden, having just run the election themselves. They were receiving death threats from fellow Republicans who didn't want them to certify the election for Joe Biden. We've seen what happened to Liz Cheney when she tried to come out against, basically to condemn Trump for his role in January 6th. And she had to have permanent guards all around her at all times. She couldn't travel without a huge security team around her. So one thing that we've been seeing in the Republican Party in particular is that there are people who try to break out, people who try to say, well, in this particular case, I think that the left won, the Democrats won. Or in this particular case, I think that what our president did was very bad, and no one should ever be allowed to do that. Those, in a normal, healthy society, would be good things to do, would be, people on the other side would appreciate them, people within the party might be convinced by them. And instead, what we've seen is those who stand up against Trump on the right are either kicked out of the party, they have to retire, or they receive death threats on a regular basis to their families. And even to some extent on the left and among Democrats, right? If there's a Democrat who is speaking well of Donald Trump, for example, that person is not taken seriously anymore within the Democratic Party, for good or bad. But that's the case, right? We haven't, as voters, we've become so entrenched in this idea of us as a political party that we have forbidden our leaders to go outside of that construct and to think of us all as Americans, for example. Bringing the other side into the we of America is not working, right? It doesn't work because the voters themselves have now turned against it. And so we have this vicious cycle, I think, where our leaders are training us to hate the other side and to think of us as us and them as them. And then that convinced people. And so now they're like, yeah, you're right. We are us and they are them, and we should not be working together anymore. And so within the party, I think it's important to pay attention also that there are these very, very powerful blocks of resistance to becoming more of a national we.
Research suggests that individuals who are exposed in high levels of political polarization have a higher likelihood of developing depressive or anxiety disorders. Also, research identifies that fear and anxiety from the basis of the polarized mind. Can you explain more about this?
So one of the, everybody I think has a good intuitive feel for this, the anger and the distaste. One of the phenomena that I've been really interested in lately is this idea of grievance as a sort of an emotional reaction. So grievance is just the feeling that you've been treated badly, right? You've been treated unfairly. That somehow you're disadvantaged in some unfair way, and that has lots of really terrible. That feeling has lots of terrible political consequences. First of all, so if you feel like you've been aggrieved, like you've been treated poorly, it licenses you to respond back in kind. So if you feel like the other side stole an election from you, I feel like I can steal an election from them. So it has this sort of escalatory quality where every time somebody does something bad, they do it back to each other. It's also a sort of a terrible way to react, to feel that feeling that you've been wrong, that the other side, if they're in power, that they're doing things that are just unfair and wrong, and it nauseates you. And both sides feel that to a certain extent. It's hard sometimes to flip yourself around to realize that just as my side might be feeling that they've been wrong, the other side very often feels the same way. It feels the same sort of distaste and offensiveness when they hear your moral views that you experience when you hear theirs. And that sort of moral sort of quality to it it's one of the sort of latest developments in the study of traumatic stress is the idea of moral injury. That a lot of post-traumatic stress symptoms have this moral core. So if you think about a battlefield scenario, it's doing something that you feel like you shouldn't have done, or watching things happen that you feel were morally wrong, and that sort of moral quality to it. And I think that's a lot of what we're experiencing, right? When the other side, I was just, my wife earlier today was saying, I feel like, she's watching the news, saying, I feel like I want to put my head through the wall, right? I go, that's it. When you just feel like it's morally offensive what the other side's doing, it really gnaws at people, and it creates that sort of anger and anxiety, very often fear, particularly when they're in power. And so, I think that you could see the connections between the political and the personal in that sort of situation.
Hearing the example you just used, the experience that your wife had watching TV, we have the obvious relationship between TV or the media in general and the anxiety we feel whenever we watch the news, for instance. And a couple of weeks ago, I had the chance to attend a discussion that was take place in the Stavros Niarchos Foundation library in New York. Dr. Mason was interviewed, actually, and at some point you said that, actually, I don't want to transfer your position about the polarization because it was magic, but you said that the polarization is not the actual problem, but there is a very big responsibility on behalf of journalists and academics. Could you please elaborate on that?
This is one of my more controversial, I think, opinions. It's a professional opinion, though, that in general, we talk about the problems of our politics as polarization, and that is a very useful way to talk about it because it doesn't blame anything. It's a very good way to cover the problem and just say, everyone's going crazy. We don't know why. There's no reason. It's just happening. And the way that I think of it is like, if one party is moving towards authoritarianism, you don't want the other party to also move towards authoritarianism to reduce polarization, right? That's not what you want. So polarization is not the thing we're trying to stop altogether. In fact, if one party is moving towards authoritarianism, you want the other party to stay where they are. And so one of the problems I've found with both academia and journalism is that we have very, very strong norms around political neutrality. And what that does is it doesn't allow us to say when something is truly happening within one party more than in the other party, particularly in the Trump years, that this is a problem within the party. This is a problem in the US case. This is a problem within the Republican Party. There is extremism occurring and promotion of violence, truly, that is just simply not happening on the other side. And to call that polarization, I think, is really not telling the full truth of what is actually happening. And I'll also say that one of the things that I think of as a huge driver of all of this, at least in the US, is that we've seen so much social progress over the last 50 years. I mean, my own mother couldn't get a credit card without her husband's permission when she was 28 years old. So, and this is not the case today. And we've made so much progress with gender equality, with racial equality, with LGBT equality, and it's happened very, very quickly. And I think what Peter was saying about the sense of grievance is a lot of the time on the right is a sense that status and power has been taken away from the people who used to hold that power alone. And so it does feel like a loss. It does feel like someone's taken something from them. And we really, one of the big battles I think we're having in the US, without anyone saying it out loud, is about equality. Is it about what kind of democracy do we want to be?
To the name of social equality. And in addition to what just Dr. Mason said, and the question is to both of you, what's going on? Where do we stand, or even more / better, governments, institutions, states, regarding the social equity? I mean, there is a difference. I mean, we usually hear about percents, how many, now I'm using this example in the States, for instance, X% of African Americans take place here, X% of coming from other countries. It's all about percents. It's all about checking the box, finally, if I'm allowed to make also my comment on that.
You mean so we've turned all of this social process into numbers? Well, and I think that part of it is that. Right?
And if it's actually it's all the work that we have to do. So if we complete this number, that means that we have done the work. Yeah.
The way that I've been thinking about it is more that we have our census in the United States has found that we will be minority white country by 2042, I think. And when some researchers have told people this fact in surveys and then asked them more questions about politics. And what they found is that for white American respondents, when they hear that fact, they become more conservative immediately. So they want less government help for people. They want less progress towards equality in a variety of spheres. And they're more accepting of sort of extremist right-wing politicians. So I think it's something that's sort of happening in people's minds, that we are changing. We are changing as a country. And as we sort of feel that happening, I think a lot of people are feeling their status slip away, what their perceived status is, right? The traditional social hierarchy where, white Christian men are on top and then everyone else is somewhere below, that is a real threat. It feels like a real threat. It is a true grievance, right? It feels like they are losing something, and that, they will follow the political party that is defending that status against these changes. So there is, it's not just a number thing, it's a feeling of gradually losing status.
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to whether there's any sort of positive aspect of polarization. So a lot of people would argue that polarization is partly a function of previously disenfranchised people getting a voice. And so when they come in, they've got different interests, different values, they clash with this other group. And the reason we didn't have polarization before was because it was a bunch of old white men, and they all agreed, whether the differences were relatively small amongst them, they were trivial compared to these bigger differences. And so that's partly what's operating. I think the other thing, just to pick up on what Liliana said, is as a psychologist and as scientists generally, we try to stay neutral. It is interesting. I study political bias, and I study sometimes how political bias changes people's interpretation of science, and I'm a scientist doing work and I'm trying to evaluate who has political views and trying to keep myself somehow neutral in all this. But I think what's crucial to recognize is we've got this sort of natural process of group conflict, but it can be exploited by political actors. And that's partly what's happening. Former President Trump is a grievance machine. I mean, that is a political strategy that's used, and it's a well-worn political strategy among populist leaders, is to say, well, gee, here's we the folks are being screwed by the elite somehow, and it's very effective. It engages emotion, it mobilizes action, and it capitalizes on what I think is sort of the natural evolutionary flow. So. Democracy is an uphill evolutionary putt, right? It's not natural for us to get into groups with people who don't look like us, who don't share our values, and get along calmly and make decisions. Through almost all of our history, we've been splitting up into groups of people who kind of look like us and believe the things that we do and trying very hard to beat the other side. And so it's hard to push people toward calm, democratic deliberation. It's easy to foment conflict. And conflict, if that's in your political, if it's to your political advantage, right? That's what we have going on. And there's people who are actively trying to make us dislike the other side, to say the facts that you have are not the real facts. We have these facts, and it's a real problem. And some of it's and it feels like gaslighting. I think a lot of times, right? It feels like somebody's telling you things. You watch the TV and say that's just not what's happening, and it's maddening, right? I mean, it has lots of psychological consequences and political consequences. And I think it's important to realize that these natural processes that we try to study can often be exploited as well by motivated political actors.
I'll stay a bit more, Dr. Dito, on what do you call all this time morality. We see in polarized environments that a group often believe that the other side, you mentioned that in the beginning of our discussion, lacks morals. You have studied the moral foundations theory, which suggests people have different sets of morals which guide their political views. Could you share more about this, how actually this theory explains the way we form our views, the way you described earlier, and its impact on division in our community?
Sure. I'll try and do this quickly. So moral foundations theory was originally developed by Jonathan Haidt, and I was part of, we collaborated a lot on a lot of the empirical work on it. And it's really, it's not a theory of politics, it's a theory of morality and the basic building blocks of morality across cultures. And we argue that there's 5 or maybe 6 these basic foundations on which morality is built: harm, fairness, in-group feelings of respect for tradition and authority, and purity. And every society sort of feels those bases of morality, but they weight them differently depending on lots of different factors, cultural factors, individual differences that people have as well, so that people end up valuing them more or less. And I think that one of the real initial pushes that Haidt had when he developed this was the sense that when we look at the other side, we think they're amoral. They don't have, and we're acting morally and they're acting amorally. They're acting completely self-interested. And the difference is to say, no, people are acting morally, they just have a different moral sense than you do. And the basic finding that's been replicated dozens and dozens of times is that political liberals tend to only care about harm and fairness. If it doesn't harm somebody, if it's not unfair, it's really not morally wrong. Political conservatives have a more traditional moral view, which is that weights all 5 of these relatively highly. So things can be offensive because they're disloyal, like being unpatriotic, disrespecting authority, or being impure in some way, treating your body like a plaything rather than a temple. And so a lot of the political clashes that we see can be sort of derived from if you view them through that lens, you can see how the two groups would differ in their moral views simply because of that they hold different moral sensibilities. And I think that's important to recognize, that the other side has moral views. They may be different from yours. And that theoretically, we could talk about those and have a nice, calm discussion about our moral differences. And that's what I think people are saying. They say, oh, I like to talk to other people. In practice, what really happens, right, is you get angry very quickly. Right, and when people start to say things that you find are morally offensive, then the anger rises. On top of that, what we have this problem is that our moral views bias the way we process facts and what we believe. So the two sides have very different, there's a huge fact gap in the United States where the two sides just don't believe in the same sort of facts. And when somebody starts spouting facts that you just say, that's just wrong, right? It's maddening. When you can't have a discussion, you can't compromise, you can't negotiate, you can't agree on sort of basic ground level facts. And so that's what, moral foundation theory starts with this idea that you have these kind of moral differences, and then you can sort of, it organizes all sorts of things and gets stamped in, and everybody rallies around their own political views and then is offended by the other sides.
You know that this Sunday we have the national elections here in Greece. Mm-hmm. Oh no, you brought me many examples on my mind while I was hearing you. This is not happening in the US.
It's so this is a broad phenomenon that we're seeing, this sort of liberal democracy versus illiberal democracy. And there's real similarities between many of the authoritarian sort of leaning leaders, right? The populist leaders, share a real similarity. You can see the same dynamics in Greece and Hungary and India and around the world as you see in the United States. It's a global phenomenon.
I agree as a citizen, of course, not as an academic, but that also gets me back to the discussion that took place a couple of weeks ago, because there you also said, and I felt that this is also something very obvious in Europe, the fact that we're talking about polarization, but not on the same base. We are not polarized on the same base, so consequently, we are not actually polarized because we don't have one thing either to agree or to disagree. We're talking totally different languages to totally different group of people for totally different reasons with totally different purposes. So the one, I remember your example, and I give the floor to you, and I have also a couple of very interesting questions. They have arrived on our app, and I would like to share them with you. But it's very important, the fact that you said that one party may talk about tax policy, bad or good. It doesn't matter, because there is not criticism, because there is not any argument and any disagreement on that. On the other hand, you may listen about how we are under the threat of refugees, for instance.
Right, and some people don't think that's true.
How can the citizen vote?
So one of the things that we saw in the 2020 election, well, in 2016 also, but in particular 2020 because it was contested, was that Trump supporters in particular said, there's no way that Biden could have won because I've never met a Biden supporter. I've never heard from one. I've never seen one in my neighborhood. There's not a single one in my kids' school. There's nobody at my workplace. When I watch Fox News, I don't see anybody, right? And so honestly, in the U.S., one of the big problems is that we are geographically segregated from each other by partisanship, and so it is possible for somebody in Wyoming to never meet a Democrat, and in their entire life never meet a Democrat. And so when it comes to election day and the polls say Biden won, that feels like a lie to them. There's no way for that to be true. So they're operating on a very different system of information. And for Democrats, it can be very similar depending on the area, although Democrats tend to live in urban places that are very diverse, that they're, in New York City, for example, the two zip codes that donate the most to the Republican and the Democratic parties are the Upper East Side and the Upper West Side of Manhattan. So they're both there, right? People know each other. So there is this sort of isolation of the voter into their own political space, but also just their narrative space, their idea of what the problems are, who the problems are, if that's where they're thinking, and they've never heard otherwise. So to the extent that we want our voters to be more exposed to information that they're not familiar with, right, that is one way that could possibly influence voter behavior, but they don't want to see that information. When they see it, they reject it because it doesn't conform with their life. And so that it's very difficult to take facts and say, like, look, these are the facts. This is what's real. That's not part of their experience, and they don't want to hear it, and they're not interested in being curious about, facts that other people might believe because they don't exist in their mind.
I'll start with a question that it was sent on the app to you. Professor Mason it says that Professor Mason mentioned that our leaders are training us to hate the other side. Does this just apply to populism, authoritarian learning leaders, or are moderate politicians also guilty of moralizing the other side?
So I think that it doesn't justify becoming more extreme, I don't think. But it does create very different incentives for different politicians. And so if there is a politician, as Peter was saying, that is, using this populist rhetoric to make people angry and to make them dislike one another and to blame each other for the problems in their lives, then a leader who focuses on that will receive a set of supporters who are not thinking very critically. And that's the point, right? They don't want their voters to be wondering, like, is that really true? Or like, did that really happen? Like, they want their voters to be saying, this is true, this happened because my leader told me that it did. And I'm not gonna question it, and I'm going to hate people on the other side even more, and that's gonna motivate all of my political behavior. And so that this role of elites is one thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently because they are very powerful in changing the way that we think about our own politics. And so I've run some experiments where if you have someone who approves of political violence, have them read a quote from Donald Trump or Joe Biden saying violence is never acceptable, they become less approving of violence. One sentence. They just read one sentence, and after that, they're like, actually, I'm not sure that I really... And so that's an extraordinarily powerful effect from a very short intervention in a survey that we provided for them. So the one thing that we've been seeing more and more is that what leaders say has a huge influence, and it very, very much matters. And we haven't actually been asking our leaders to be more responsible with how they speak and what they do, who they blame. Right? We're not actually asking them to do anything. We're looking at the voters and saying, like, what's your problem? But often we do need to look at the leadership and what they're saying to people. And if they're saying violent things, and we've been seeing this a lot in the US with elected officials saying relatively violent things and other people telling them that's a dangerous thing, you shouldn't do that. And they say, it's just talk, it's just words, don't worry about it.
I would like to give the floor to all of you who would like to raise any questions to the speakers. So please raise your hand and we will bring to you a microphone. Okay, here we have one question. Okay.
Okay, I'm here.
Go ahead.
I'm a moderate person as a citizen, I'm a centrist, but I find it hard sometimes to be moderate when I see someone else from the other side trying to take away my rights and impose their policy on my life and limit my freedom. How can I stay moderate when this happens? Should I?
Do you want to stay moderate when that happens? I mean, this is one of those things where we have this ideal center voter, right? So the centrist voter who sometimes votes for one side and sometimes votes for the other side and is not extreme in their opinions in either direction. But this is sort of like the point I made about polarization, where if one side is becoming more and more extreme and removing rights from their citizens, do we want our centrists to move closer to that, right? Do we want our centrists to stay centrist? Do we want them to move closer to the extremist party because they are centrist? Or is being centrist a matter of thinking for yourself and making your own decisions in politics and not being swayed by what the elites are saying on either side? That's a very different kind of centrism. And if a party has abandoned you as a citizen in terms of your rights, then I think it makes sense to say, that's not my party, they're attacking me. I'll stay closer to this other party now because that's a rational decision. It's not being not centrist if the center has moved.
Dr. Dito, I would like to ask you, if it is according to our nature, I mean humans' nature, if is there any limit or not accepting in some way, for any reason, under a threat? I don't know. That's why I want you to give us the facts, actually, and what psychology, the science of psychology says regarding the violence, because it's also a word that we very often listen, but I feel that we very often feel that we may accept at some point violence, even we at the same time may answer, no, I don't accept violence.
Yeah, again, I think this is sort of part of this grievance cycle that I think yours was over here was a great example of that, where somebody does something offensive that you perceive as offensive on the other side, and it pushes you back. And the two parties don't exist independently. They have sort of a harmonic relationship with one another. One side pushes, the other side pushes back. Again, this idea, this is one of the sort of key problems, right? This acceptance of political violence. And that's the sort of natural consequence of feeling aggrieved. So if somebody takes an election away from you, then you decide, well, now what do I need to do? Well, now I feel like attacking you, and that could be morally acceptable. So that's what grievance does, is it takes things that didn't used to be acceptable and it makes them acceptable. So my favorite example of that is if you would have asked Democrats in the United States 10 years ago, would it be okay to take a Supreme Court justice away from the other side, they probably would have said no. Now, after the Republican Party was able to sort of take that Supreme Court justice away from the Democrats, now the Democrats are all saying, oh yeah, that's totally acceptable now. And again, if the other side steals an election, you might say, well, we'll steal one, and then it kind of keeps going back and forth. To drop another metaphor that I really like, it's like the kids in the back seat of the station wagon when they start to fight. That one of them, you ask him what's going on back there, and he says, well, he hit me first, well, he hit me harder. And that's what happens. The first one hits, and then the next hit is harder, and then the next hit after that is harder, and then everybody's got a position that they're aggrieved. It's like, well, he hit me first, well, he hit me harder. Everybody feels morally justified, and it just seems to escalate like that. And that's the risk, is that as as everything degrades and becomes, everybody feels more and more mistreated and aggrieved, then it just starts to justify and license these more extreme reactions.
What kind of findings have you noticed to the research that you have been running regarding violence?
Right, so I started working on studying violence with my co-author Nathan Calmo in 2017. We started collecting data. At that point, people were like, why are you asking people about this? It's not a problem in America. And then it actually was very rare for people to tell us that they accepted violence sometimes for political goals. And so it was around 7% of Republicans and Democrats said it might be okay to use violence for achieving political goals. By 2021, it was 24% of Republicans and 17% of Democrats. I mean, both had become much, much more accepting of violence. And it's, to be clear, not that every one of those people is going to engage in violence. But what that does is it creates a much more permissive environment for people who might be unstable, who might be willing or just naturally more violent in their communities, right? We had a very strong norm in our society around violence is not the way that you get things done in politics. And so when there's 7% of people in your community saying like, it might be, that's not very many people, but if it's 25%, then all of a sudden the person who is the volatile individual who's going to be violent in some way might believe that it's okay to use that violence in a political way. And there's just fewer people around them to say, no, we never do that.
I would like now to... I have so many things into my head. I mean, I want to ask so many questions because I think that all of us, or at least the majority of us, feel very close to what you both described during this discussion. But I would like to ask all of you, yes, a microphone please, here we have more questions, and there, yes. But before, I would like to ask you to join to an experiment. I would like you to reply to 3 similar questions, not exactly the same questions, that we saw previously to the polling that is ongoing through our app. So please join. It's very interesting to see the results, to see where do you stand and how you're going to reply to those 3 similar, but not exactly the same questions like previously. Yes?
My question is to both the panelists. So much of geopolitics across the world is now based on hate and toxicity. And this toxicity is manifested as a nationalistic pride for citizens. How do we even start dealing with this kind of injury to the psyche of the entire system?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult problem. I think, again, one way to analogize it is once you lose trust in somebody, once that breaks down, and I think that's sort of one of the real hallmarks of this sort of a zeitgeist-like phenomenon that we're going through, is this loss of trust in institutions, in government, in the media, in science, where a lot of people are mistrusting all these things, and so there's this sort of boiling pot of mistrust. And if you talk to marriage counselor or therapist, they'll tell you the hardest thing is to rebuild trust. And it's once you lose trust in people, once they've done things and gone over a line, then it's really, really challenging to how do you repair that injury, right? And if in a marriage context, if it's marital infidelity or something, it's like how do you rebuild trust? And I think that's the difficult problem we're in. I think a little humility helps. So one of the things that sort of if we start on an individual level, right? So one of the problems is that people, I've always said America is having a crisis of confidence. They're way too confident. Everybody sort of has their views, and they really believe that these views are true and backed up. And if we all sort of back up a little bit, sort of challenge it, well, gee, do I really know what I believe? Do I really, am I really certain about this? Maybe I should listen to some other people. And hear their views. I think that's helpful, and this idea of intellectual humility is out there. I think there's also moral humility that would be very helpful. Sort of a sense of, I have my moral views, you have your moral views, and I can tolerate those, right? I can accept those. I can live and let live. I think that's very helpful. On the other side, right, sometimes things are just morally offensive. Again, I think Liliana did a good job. It's like, well, gee, should you just walk away? Shouldn't you be outraged about something? And so we should be outraged, but I think we have to figure out how to deal with each other in a more humble way, or at least a more civil way. And again, I'm not a good enough psychologist to know how to do that exactly, but I think that's the goal.
I would also say that nationalism has frequently been used to excuse hatred. That's just one of the ways that it's often worked. And it does sort of, I think, it launders hatred in a way that allows it to become a political issue rather than a hatred is bad issue. And it works very well with our news media, right? It works well with journalists because they take this now and they say, well, it's just about national identity. It's not about hatred, so it's fine. We're going to put that on the equal platform with a different view of what the country should be. And it's, it works really well. It works every time. It's a great way to just sneak a lot of hatred into our political discourse.
Thank you both. We have one more question here.
Thank you all for all that you have just said, because it helps me for this week that it is before the elections, and it's going to be a difficult week for me. But I want to tell you that maybe we should focus on places that they don't have a lot of polarization, like Sweden, Norway, Switzerland. My niece, for example, in Switzerland is just, every now and then she gets a leaflet of 100 pages or so, and she has to fill in the blanks, and she understands what's the opinion of the Democrats and what is the opinion of the other, but she just has to fill in the blanks, and that's all. She's a little bit bored, not polarized. And even Sweden, I have some friends and call them and they say, you have elections, but they don't really care for their own elections because anyhow, the result is not going to change their world and their view and their moral set of things. So anyhow, I thank you very much because I think talking and being together with people is important, and anything that you say is important for me. Thank you all.
We thank you.
Can I speak to that, or?
Yes, please, but I have some more questions.
So, I think the one thing you bring up is sort of the entertainment value of politics, and it shouldn't be missed. We're in Athens, which is the birthplace of both democracy and drama, and sometimes I think that isn't a coincidence, right? I mean, the two just go together, and there's a real blurring of those, particularly in the United States. It's exciting. It's interesting. Nobody wants to watch two people getting along. We want to watch the sides fight, and all the incentive, the financial incentives in the United States, I think, are very perverse, right? Everybody benefits from conflict. There's no interest in just sort of having a policy discussion. What we get into is a lot of sort of trying to own the other side. So everybody's sort of insulting the other side, trying to make them look bad, and that just doesn't persuade anybody, right? So nobody's ever been persuaded to change their mind by being owned by the other side. All it does is foment more conflict. And maybe we all want to crave a more boring political environment.
Please, if there are more questions, raise your hands, and I would like to hear about solutions, so start thinking, both of you.
Solutions.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Tim Lücke. Thank
Hi.
you so much for the talk. I have a critical sort of question. I really like the point about academia and the role of neutrality. I got my PhD in the United States as well, at the Ohio State University, and being politically neutral is sort of a mantra. It's the Weber argument, ideally. But my partner here and I, we drove through the United States and had in-depth interviews with 50 Americans about why they believe Donald Trump was voted. And that topic, academia and the role of academics in the public sphere, came up again and again. And I campaigned for Barack Obama in 2008, so I'm not politically neutral. But I think the picture that you're painting that, oh, maybe we should stop being politically neutral is not actually the picture. Most academics in the United States, at least, I would say in Germany, where we're from as well, are not politically neutral. And we have our own biases, right, which is, I think, fine. It's just what you study, right? But it also affects our work, and it is perceived by many people as problematic as well. So, yes.
I think that's I take that point I understand what you're saying very clearly. It may be that because I'm coming from the study of American politics, that we have been very trained to, when I was in graduate school, they were telling me a story about a professor who had never voted in his life, and he was the pinnacle of American politics research. And so this is, and I think the journalists come from the same place, where it's, if your partisanship comes through, then you're doing your job wrong. And it's not that I'm suggesting that we should be more partisan. It's that I'm suggesting that when one team is breaking the rules the most, that it's not unacceptable to point that out. It comes across as partisan, but in fact it's just reporting what's happening. And our commitment and our training for neutrality often prevents us from saying, actually, this is happening a lot more on this side, and because that makes them look like a partisan. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you for a great discussion. I am a psychiatrist in the United States and have watched, obviously, the politics over the last 6 years, and was surprised that we had the president we had, and realized that not everybody has the same information or insights, and have tried to really understand it from that view. But I've also been hopeful at times when more information comes out that perhaps we will have a change again, and each time have been disappointed. And I'm wondering if there is any research on what might be a tipping point where our politicians may actually take some responsibility so that what happened with Liz Cheney will not happen, so that they do stand up, particularly as Donald Trump perhaps loses political power with the various legal difficulties he's in, et cetera. But yeah, that is, I think, a very interesting, it takes, whenever you're trying to gather people together, a certain amount of people before things change. I also had the wonderful opportunity to have my patients tell me I was missing something during the 2016 election, and I was. And that had to do with social media and the groups they were in that I was not, since I don't really do social media. So very interesting what is out there behind the scenes, and what we see, as you pointed out, in the basic news, and then what is on social media, and then what can we do to really solve this and get enough people to truly understand it, and have our politicians start saying what needs to be said. Thank you.
Would you like to make any comment?
Yeah, I just want to provide a metaphor that I heard from a man named Curtis Chang, who is he's an evangelical pastor who was a Republican and has left the party. And he was speaking to people who are still Republicans, but also are very much pro-democracy. And he said, I want you to think of it this way. You have a very nice ship that you are all sailing together. Pirates board your ship. You have 3 choices. 1, you jump off the ship. But if you jump off the ship alone, then you're probably going to drown because you need help from other people. 2, you fight the pirates. But if you fight the pirates alone, they're going to kill you. So you need other people around you. What you can do alone is hide. Oh. And if you hide, then eventually you have to start acting like a pirate. And eventually you become a pirate. Exactly. And that, I think, is a lot of what we've been seeing with what happened with Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, for example, is that what we're seeing is that individual Republicans are coming out alone. And they're just being destroyed, right? They're getting kicked out of the party, they're losing their seats. But if there was a way to have everyone come up together, right, to work together to either do the fighting or the leaving, then that would, I think, create a better space for these kind of more reasonable voices to come out. It's just that right now everyone is hiding.
I'll repeat it, and please, we have one more question, the last one there. Okay, two the last questions, but I want to repeat that we may hear examples from the States, but this is not just an American phenomenon. I mean, we are many Europeans here, and I feel, I found myself to what I hear. I mean, it's not, yes, of course, some personalities, their stamp, I mean, was hard or tough, but the ecosystem and this formula, it's so familiar, yeah.
So, hi. First, it's a great conversation and great dialogues, and very interesting, of course. So my question is, this conversation, although interesting, is a bit more based in a two-party political system. So my question would be about a multi-polarized society like the one in Greece. So what are your thoughts as experts on the subject? Are we talking about a situation where it's more confusing for the citizens? Are we having a greater divide between them? Or is there more hope in an environment with that many poles for the citizens to move towards too? Thank you.
If I'm allowed, I would like to add to your question something bigger, because we talked earlier about social equality and everything is happening under this name, the social equality. And here we're trying to find the space even to discuss. But Chrysula actually, because she is a data journalist and I know her, she talked about the Greek model with the parties who get into the parliament, etc., which is it's different from the two parties model in the States. But as I said earlier, the whole scene seems exactly the same. What about the pandemic, for instance? It's not a political issue, from what I know. I mean, or maybe politicians, I mean, shared it with the people, with humans. But the pandemic, a medical matter, with social consequences and layers, yes, many. That was the first dialogues discussion during the lockdown. But we saw people voting regarding and being based on what and how politicians politicized a medical issue. So, which part of our body suffers more from the pandemic, finally?
Well, you brought up, I mean, COVID's a great example of politicization, and I mean, you could literally, there's wonderful data to trace, that goes all the way from political persuasion to behavior, to higher probability of contracting the disease, to hospitalization, to death. You can being a political conservative in the United States was a risk factor for death from COVID. And it's jarring when you see something that seems so apolitical, like a medical condition, that gets sucked into this vortex of polarization and has changed so much. And that people are literally willing to die to own the libs, is the way that we would talk about it in the United States. And I just want to speak to this two-party system, because Liliana probably knows more about this than I do, but I think that really is part of the problem, or it exacerbates the problem of having only two sides, right? So I have a graduate student years ago who used this term zero-sum truth. So this idea is, why do politicians spend all their time arguing about that you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong? Because the idea is, if you're wrong, I must be right. If there's only two, two choices.
Or if someone doesn't, and nowadays, I mean, even today, but what about 2 years ago, if someone didn't wear a mask, for instance, that immediately meant that he or she belonged to X or Z party? No. Why? How?
Right, and what I would hope, I hold out hope for sort of a third party in the United States, something like that would diffuse some of this tendency to just say, well, when there's two people, it's just too easy to say good and evil. When there's a third one, or I'm right and you're wrong. Well, but then when there's flavors, then everything gets diffused. And there's a little bit of science that supports that. When you have three groups, people sort of divvy up resources a little bit more equitably. And so again, it's not an antidote, apparently, but it may help a bit.
There's some research by political scientists that have found that in multi-party systems, we tend to see less animosity between partisans. And often that's because they have to work in coalitions. So that the who's us and who's them is complicated, because sometimes they're in the coalition and sometimes they're not in the coalition. And so it's not as much of a zero-sum situation. But one other thing that we've seen is that when the parties take two sides on one thing, that's when it becomes very bad. So during Brexit in the UK, what we found was that Labour and Conservatives didn't hate each other, but Remain and Leave really hated each other. So it wasn't the parties that were structuring that. It was the two sides of one, uncompromisable issue. So to the extent that the parties decide together to take two sides on one thing, that makes it worse.
Let's see, before closing with your question, let's see the results to the last polling, the last three questions. Or we can compare, actually, can we compare? Okay. So, do you want to live in a world without polarization? Yes. We see that 68% previously replied yes, and 67%, so it's exactly the same, 32 and 33. So, you strongly believe. Okay. And the second question, with a minor change, the second question says now, after hearing today's conversation, are you more likely or less likely to engage in discussions with people who share totally different views? Okay, we see a minority. They have been transformed. 79 was those who replied yes, and now they are 85 from you. You said yes. I was sure that it was to the 21%. I don't know where am I right now. I don't know what kind of analysis do I need, but I have more questions. And the third question, have you ever felt angry because of politics? 5% said no. Lucky you. And after hearing today's discussion, do you have a better understanding of why people might feel angry because of politics? Only 30% said no. But
I have a science question.
Okay.
Is the number of people who answered the second question the same as the number of people who answered the first question?
We can run also this polling. We can stay here. I mean, the rest of the days. I know that for some sessions of the conference, they may need this area, this hall, but yeah, this is also interesting. If we would like to be absolutely correct, this is also interesting. But are they solutions? Oh, no, before that, before the solutions, what about both of you as citizens being, not as academics? Have you ever felt confusing, or have you ever felt fear, anxiety, as citizens being, I mean?
Yes, I've certainly felt anger. I worry a lot. I've been told before I'm depressing when I talk about this, so I'm a little sensitive. But yeah, I'm not optimistic about. We have some bumpy roads to go through here, particularly in the United States. Things aren't developing well right now. I'm fearful of the future, very uncertain of it. I have a lot of faith in people that hopefully will come through this, but I don't think it's going to be a smooth ride.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely felt angry. Even at my own, Thanksgiving table, everyone has that one uncle that I'm always fighting with. But I'm afraid for my daughters. I'm afraid for their friends that they don't participate in society in the kind of traditional ways. I'm afraid for their ability to live their lives the way that they are accustomed to, and so there is something very personal for me, is that this idea of these young girls growing up into this world that seems to be getting worse every day.
I mean, another just fact I'd add in that worries me is we just ran a study not too long ago where we asked people if they'd ever broken off any kind of a social relationship based on politics, and 35% of the people said that they had. And it's that social fracturing that's also a problem, and it's a shame, right? And it's understandable, but it's not a good sign when people are breaking off close relationships because of politics.
Is there any solution? I mean, we're talking by having in mind what happens in the field of politics by politicians per se. But is there any way that we can deal with all these conditions?
Well, so there was a big scientific study that was just done in the United States it's called the Strengthening Democracy Challenge, where they tried basically any kind of researcher could put in some kind of an intervention that they thought would decrease partisan animosity, support for violence, support for undemocratic action. And it was, again, they had like 250 people, scientists apply. They tested 25 of these interventions. And the ones that worked the best were ones that sort of broke down some of the misperceptions. One of the problems is perceived polarization. At least there's some evidence that perceived polarization is larger than actual polarization. So people, it's very common for example, liberals to think that conservative views are more conservative than conservative views really are, and for liberals to do the same. And so interventions that broke down that and said, well, people really aren't necessarily as sort of extreme on these issues as possible, or as you thought, then that seemed to help. That seemed to have some impact. I mean, what I worry about any of these interventions is it's how to scale these things up. Psychological science has produced a variety of different sorts of interventions that seem effective in some level, but then how do you scale them up into a societal, effective intervention? And I think, again, the other problem, I think, is it's hard to intervene in this situation. There's lots of measures of trying to get misinformation controlled, and I just think all of those have this flavor of trying to start a mediation during a bar fight, right? I mean, it's just hard when there's so much animosity. If we could just dial the temperature down a little bit, again, how to do that is difficult, but it's tough to intervene and change anything when there's so much animosity.
What do you think?
So I think that leaders have a big role to play. The problem is that their motivations are often based on how to get more votes and how to get more money, and those things, you really want to create more conflict to get those things. And so having leaders be more responsible participants in the democracy, I'm not sure how we do it, but that's the one thing that could tone things down, right? If our most divisive leaders were to say, we've gone too far, let's just take a break. The other thing is that the media environment is under the same constraints. It makes the media more money to present conflict. Reality shows are lots of fun to watch. That's not a coincidence that we had a reality show host for a president. He knew very well how conflict sells. People getting along and sitting and talking rationally are not something that people want to watch. Our news media tend to focus on topics as win versus lose. So, this is legislation that just passed. instead of saying this is what it does, it says this is a win for Democrats, right? By framing things in a win-loss, it gets more people looking at it, it gets more attention, it gets more clicks, but it also frames our thinking in a win-lose type of framework. So I think that a lot of our structures that we've built are structures to create more attention rather than more responsible commitment to democracy. Mm-hmm. And that's a monetary problem. That's an incentives problem. And so to the extent that we can make it very clear that if money is not, money's not the only thing we're going for here. We want actually, this is a democracy. This is what it looks like. This is what we are aiming for in the future, how we can make it better. To have some of our most powerful systems and individuals pay attention to that goal rather than how do I get more money and clicks tomorrow.
So that means, if I understand correct, that there is a need of coordination. So that means that we should start again coordinating. So that means that we, if I understand correct, this is a follow-up question. Should we, and if yes, how could we strengthen even more and encourage even more our communities, wherever do we belong, even if this is our neighborhood or if this is our community dedicated on this or on that?
I mean, the problem is that very partisan people are willing to sacrifice their own well-being, material well-being, mm-hmm. for victory. And that is not a normal human, I mean, it is a normal human thing, but like it hurts you. Yeah. And it hurts your family and your community. Yeah. So, that is one angle in perhaps where we could try to break that relationship. I'm not sure how to do it, but clearly all of the motivations for our political system are operating with the wrong stimulus. It's all coming from how do we get eyes, how do we get attention, how do we get money, instead of this is what a pluralistic democracy looks like, how do we get there?
Okay, thank you. Your last question?
Is it open? Yeah. Thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. So first of all, I would like to agree with you. It's not a coincidence that democracy and drama were born here. Greek democracy can be sometimes drama. So my question, it seems to me that our discussion is based on a presumption that we perceive democracy as a state-bound concept, in a sense that democracy exists only within the state, within the boundaries of the state. So bearing in mind that we live in a globalized world, as the pandemic has proven, I was wondering whether you think that we should turn to democracy beyond the state, and if yes, how can we ensure that there is inclusion? Because it seems to me that inclusion, the lack of inclusion, is one of the main problems that we're facing today. Thank you.
So do you mean global democracy? Like, I mean, sort of international? Well, I mean, again, that's probably above my pay grade. I'm not sure I know how to answer that exactly. But you would have many of the same problems, right? If you upscale it to the next level, with the same, if we had the same sort of incentive structure and everything else for conflict, making the problem bigger or it doesn't seem like that's likely to do well. But I don't know, Liliana, do you have any?
Well, the SNF Agora Institute's mission is to strengthen global democracy. So we're working on it. We just started.
I don't know how.
I mean, I think that it's hard to imagine a body that could be trusted by all democracies. One thing that I've started to look at is actually going in the opposite direction, going to local small places and communities where national politics isn't as important, and saying, what do we want our dog catcher to do when we're electing the dog catcher? What do we want that person to do? Who do we want that person to be? Not is it, are they this party or that party, but what are their responsibilities? How can we elect a person that's most responsible to do that job? And so in the local areas, we have different loyalties. We have very specific ideas of who we are. We have sports teams. We have, a variety of institutions that only people in that space are really loyal to. But that can cut across national politics. And I think that one thing we should be doing is focusing more into these communities and local places to create a sense of what democracy should feel like And then hopefully that can spread to the broader nation.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank all of you very much, but I would like to thank you, Dr. Mason and Dr. Dito, for your participation and your discussion. Thank you so much. Furthermore, I would like to emphasize that the SNF Nostos conference on mental health, which starts today, embodies openness, accessibility, and encouragement for individuals to actively participate. So this aligns with the ethos of both SNF Dialogues, SNF Nostos, and the conference per se. And at the same time, SNF Nostos, through an exceptional collaboration with the Release Athens Festival this year, is already on, as you know, so stay tuned for the incredible performances that are yet to come. Now, my favorite time, I want to be honest, because Dr. Tito, this is how I feel, and I would like to express it. I would like to ask all the members of the U Advisory Committee to stand up, please. I'm really very happy having all of you here. I have to say that all these young people are the Youth Advisory Committee of the conference. They're with us a couple of months right now. They know in a very detailed way the structure, the design, its speaker, its topic, its layer of the conference that just started and will take place the upcoming days. They have been involved with the design, as I said, and the final shape of the conference. You will have the chance to hear and meet all of these young people tomorrow. They will share with you views, intros, info about the sessions, but also the personalities who inspired us. They are not just experts, but they can also share with all of us their thoughts, their knowledge, and their ideas. So thank you so much for being with us, for being on board to this effort. Half of them, which means the last year's Youth Advisory Committee, and I can see some of you, were sitting here taking part to the dialogues discussion that took place last year during the Nostos. Now you are 11, the members of the Youth Advisory Committee. So we're very curious and excited to join tomorrow and on Friday, of course, the conference and meet all of you. But I would like to go to Abby. Hi, Abby.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
You one of those who were sitting there last year.
Yes.
Did you like this year's dialogues?
Yeah.
They were cool.
So incredible.
Okay.
And mind-blowing.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
What about the conference? What do we have to wait the upcoming days?
There's a lot. There is so much. So first of all, it's so...
1 or 2 pages?
Just one page. Okay. So it's so exciting to be back in Athens, and like the last year's conference was really, life-changing for a lot of us, and so we're excited to do the same this year. And so, we have a lot of exciting events coming up over the next couple of days here at the Stavros Niarchos Cultural Center. So, we have exciting panels that will dive into artificial intelligence in mental health, the power of arts in healing, understanding loneliness, and even exploring successful global interventions. So we have a lot of stuff that's coming up, and we want you to plug your voices into the discussions with the exciting and inspiring speakers we have. We have Glenn Close, who's the co-founder of Bring Change to Mind. We have Ruth Faden, the founder of the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics. We have Goldie Hawn, founder and CEO of the Goldie Hawn Foundation. Harold Kolpowitz, child psychiatrist and the founding president of Child Mind Institute, and so many more inspiring speakers. And if that wasn't enough, we are so excited that the President Barack Obama will be here, and he will take part in this year's conference for a conversation with the SNF co-president, Andreas Dracopoulos, on how to strengthen our democratic culture and the importance of investing in the next generation of leaders. So it's about to be so exciting. See you there. Right?
Looking forward. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you. Thank you. Stay tuned. And we will meet each other to the conference, to the Nostos, to the concerts, and of course, to the run, for all of those who will run. Thank you so much. Thank you.